Hello, I'm Marianne Domain. This is CBC News Network. We begin with the latest on the WestJet strike that has disrupted travel plans for tens of thousands of would-be passengers on this busy, long weekend.
There's thousands of dollars of things that we had to purchase for the trip, and just even not knowing what's going to happen with the money for our trip. Like not being able to get a hold of anyone all day has been infuriating.
The surprise strike by unionized airline mechanics has already forced the cancellation of more than 400 flights since Thursday. The job action comes after union members rejected a deal from WestJet earlier this month following 2 weeks of negotiations. The federal Labour Minister is pushing the two sides to have the matter resolved by arbitration. For more, let's bring in the CBC's Albert Delatella. You've been following this since yesterday. The federal Labour Minister urging that this dispute go to arbitration, but still no breakthrough in this strike yet, Albert.
Still no breakthrough. We've been tracking those numbers, and the canceled flights, unfortunately for travelers, keep inching up. 68 new cancellations so far today, according to the airline, and 407 since Thursday. And that follows this strike action. The Airplane Mechanics Fraternity Association walking its members off the job as of Friday, and that affecting 680 or so members, mechanics and others involved in airplane safety. You can see some of the picketers there in Edmonton yesterday outside of their airport. The union says that WestJet was unwilling to negotiate. CBC News spoke to one of the mechanics who was picketing there, who talked about the rising cost of living and how wages just aren't keeping up.
I don't want to be out here on the picket line, but it's something we have to do. And realistically, all of us are only out here for one main goal, and that is just to increase the working conditions of all aircraft maintenance engineers across Canada so that more of them want to join and we can keep the flying public going on their journey as safe as possible.
WestJet officials, meanwhile, quite unhappy that all this is happening. The company president, Diedrich Penn, he issued a statement late last night, and he said that every flight cancellation we are forced to issue represents hundreds of guests who are being impacted by the continued reckless actions of this union. Federal Labour Minister Seamus O'Regan, he said yesterday that that arbitration order that had been imposed by the government on Thursday, that it was, quote, clearly inconsistent with the direction that he had provided to the Canada Industrial Relations Board. And it's because of that arbitration order that this strike action had been so surprising to so many people. He did also say yesterday on social media that he has been in talk with WestJet and the union, and said that both sides need to talk to each other to work this out, and also talk to the Industrial Relations Board to bring this strike action to an end.
As we saw in those signs there on the picket lines, no engineers, no flights. And as you mentioned, that list of flights getting even bigger. So what are passengers saying amidst all of their frustration? Yeah,
a lot of concern, certainly, for people hoping to get to a destination, vacation perhaps. It is Canada Day long weekend. And yeah, they're mentioning their disappointment, their frustration, and also some unhappiness about the communication. Some feel could be better from WestJet amid all of this. Here are a few customers who talked to CBC about their experience.
It's so disappointed because the granddaughters, they on vacation and they were crying.
Unfortunately, I came this morning, the flight was cancelled. I've been here from about 6 o'clock, and I'm waiting for a standby flight, but they don't seem to get an answer.
The kids won't see their grandparents and extended family and stuff for, I think, the next 5 or 6 or so years. So, like, for them to not be able to go on this trip, it's kind of huge.
So we've been talking about a lot of numbers here, Marianne. The one number that we've been mentioning, 49,000 passengers so far affected, according to the airline. So that's what the number they say are affected so far. 250,000 scheduled to fly this long weekend. So there is a bit of a big difference there in the numbers. So we have reached out to WestJet to clarify exactly where the number stands now. One could read from that perhaps the number of disrupted passengers could likely go up in the hours ahead.
Numbers are changing. One thing not changing, the strike continues and those passengers do remain frustrated and stranded. Albert, thanks so much.
You're welcome.
So for more on this story, we're now joined by Alison Braley-Ratai. She's an associate professor of labor studies at Brock University, and we've reached her in Fonthill, Ontario, just south of St. Catharines. Thanks so much for taking the time to talk to us today.
My pleasure. Good morning.
So we've now heard, as Albert was just telling us, WestJet has canceled hundreds of flights. The number of flights continues to grow after these mechanics went on strike. It's a very complex issue, but in the simplest terms, how did we get here?
Well, I mean, as you say, it's very complicated, but I think the simplest terms are to say that the Labour Minister used power under the Canada Labour Code with regard to first contract negotiations, and I think that's actually kind of important here. The board seemed to agree, and to my understanding, took jurisdiction and said, yes, this will be settled by binding arbitration. It made sense to me that everyone then thought that a work stoppage would be precluded, because in my view, binding arbitration and the right to strike are actually mutually exclusive. So when the board then said, but nothing about that means that the workers don't still have the right to strike, the workers quite understandably said, okay, and they went out on strike. I think the biggest confusion here is where is this supposed to go, given that on one hand, the right to strike is meant to put pressure on the employer at the negotiating table. But if you have binding arbitration, then you don't have a negotiating table. So that has, I think, created a lot of unnecessary confusion, and has created a kind of situation that doesn't actually make a lot of sense in our labor relations system.
Let's talk more about that, because where do we go from here? Where do both sides go from here? Because WestJet's saying that there's not much weight when it comes to what's happening here. They even called this pure retaliation in reference to this job action by these unionized workers. So keeping that binding arbitration in mind, what is next?
Well, again, I think it's actually quite difficult to say, because this doesn't actually all sit together. I have heard some people say that, well, because there's a constitutional right to strike, which of course there is, that means that binding arbitration can't just supplant the right to strike, and therefore you can have both. But of course, that doesn't actually follow. It would have been open to the board to say, hey, there's still space for these parties to reach a negotiated settlement. That might mean going on strike. Let's let them go through that, usual traditional route and see where we end up in a couple of weeks, or maybe hopefully just a couple of days. But they didn't seem to say that. They said, we're going to send this to binding arbitration and take jurisdiction over the matter. But if you're doing that, then I don't understand what pressure the strike is actually meant to create. On the other hand, it's the board that gave the union that permission. It veritably invited them to go out on strike. So, when the Labour Minister is now saying, I hope the parties can sort of come together and, they can, work something out, I honestly don't really even know what that means, because that doesn't make sense in the context of an order for binding arbitration. It's one or the other. It's not both.
The Labour Minister did tell the airline and the unions that they need to get back together and get an agreement done. What would that even look like? And do you think the minister is doing enough here?
Well, I mean, I think the minister did, kind of has his hands tied. I appreciate that he believed, and I think there was some reason for him to believe that, when he referred this to the board and that the board would take jurisdiction, that would automatically include that there would be a work stoppage, which I think makes imminent sense. But the board having decided something different, I think it also is important that the minister has to respect the independence of the board, because if these boards have no independence, then there's a different kind of problem that's created. So, I kind of think that, the board bears some responsibility here. But I also think that obviously temperatures are high. Temperatures will necessarily get high as you're coming to the point where you're contemplating a strike. And that's sometimes even more so in the context of first contract negotiations. Because you have to remember, if this is a first contract negotiation, that means the union is relatively new. And the hurdle of even getting a union is a big hurdle for the union. It's almost invariably done against the employer's wishes. So that would have been the tension that sort of immediately preceded the beginning of negotiations. The second big hurdle for the union is to actually get a first contract. Because if you can't get a first contract, then the union essentially just kind of goes away, eventually gets decertified, no more union. So tensions do tend to be particularly high around all these kinds of factors. And so where this now goes, with the union being on strike, but the employer saying, well, no, we're not at the table, I mean, that really is a kind of $64,000 question.
And leaving so many thousands of customers frustrated and stuck in the middle, scrambling this weekend and for the next few days at least. WestJet CEO, I want to talk about the language because he blamed the union and said, quote, this was a rogue union from the U.S. that was trying to make inroads in Canada. So what impact would that type of language have on this dispute?
Well, I mean, again, temperatures being high, the more aggressive the language becomes, the higher the temperatures go. I mean, the union, for its part, has claimed that the employer has not negotiated properly, hasn't really come to the table, hasn't really been open. You know, it's impossible to put too much stock in what either side says about these things because they're complicated and we're not at the table and we don't really know. But the increasing rhetoric of hostility and blaming on either or both sides, whether it's justified or not, will of course make it all the more difficult to bring the temperature down enough to get back to the table. Maybe that's where binding arbitration comes in. But again, it's one or the other and not both. So it is really quite a confusing situation, I think, at the moment.
Given how confusing it is, then, Alison, I guess we just have to wait and see what it will take to get both sides back to the negotiating table. Thank you so much for your time and your insight this morning. That's Alison Braley Ratai. She's an associate professor of labor studies at Brock University.